Okay, so how my weekly podcast runs itself at this point. We all like metrics here. I thought I'd start there. 64.35% of all customers, leads, subscribers have come to my business, Audience Ops, in the last 3 or 4 years, mostly from hearing me on a podcast, somebody else's podcast, or one of my own podcasts. That's a exact percentage number there, just based on my gut recollection of what people tend to tell me. So close enough. All I know is that podcasts have been a significant driver of awareness for my business and leads and customers and everything. So I co-host Bootstrapped Web with my buddy Jordan Gal, who's also here. It's kind of like a fun podcast that he and I get on the mic and just talk about behind the scenes of our businesses week to week. But in the past year, since podcasts have really proven to be so significant to really all of the businesses that I'm running, I started another podcast called Productize Podcast. This was a little bit more than a year ago. And this is an interview-based show where I invite other founders, other business owners, anybody who I find interesting, who I think I can learn from, I think my audience can learn from. I kind of invite them on. And so like I do with any project that I take on at this point, I'm always going into it with this question: how will I be able to sustain this, right? So after I put in the work and the hours of creating and launching and putting something out there, how will this thing, whatever I'm working on, continue to run and continue to produce for my business, after I stop working on it? So, when I move on to whatever the next thing is, I want whatever project I'm doing to continue to work for my business. And the same is certainly true with a podcast. And so, when I started out the second podcast, Productize Podcast, it's an interview-based show, so there's more to it to keep it running. I thought about, what are kind of like the list of things that I want to be involved in actually doing and actually showing up for and putting my input in. Where can I actually add a lot of value? And so here's kind of the list of things. I mean, I want to, get on the mic and interview people who I find interesting. And, well, that's about it. There's really nothing else that I really want to be doing to keep this podcast going. But a lot of things need to happen in order for this thing to publish every single week and actually, connect with listeners and do well as a podcast. So here are the list of things that I don't want to be doing myself, but need to get done one way or another. I want interesting people to be invited on for me to interview, but I don't want to go through the work of going out and finding more people to interview. Those people need to be researched so that I can ask interesting questions when we're on air. I don't want to handle like inviting people and scheduling and all that. Audio editing and mixing, I'm not going to spend time doing that. I really just want to do the actual content, right? Writing up the show notes, catching all the links, making sure everything's transcribed and all working well there. Designing a custom featured image for every episode. I'm not going to spend my time on these things, but they need to get done if we're going to publish podcast episodes. So, upload into WordPress, setting up, scheduling, sending out new episodes to the email list to let them know, something new is dropped, posting new episodes to my social media channels. I mean, the list goes on, even emailing the guest to let them know, hey, your episode went live, you can share it out with your audience. And then, tracking stats and trends and and keeping an eye on that stuff. It's good for me to do that, but I just don't make a habit of it. So somebody should be doing it. So how does all this stuff happen without me constantly putting my time and input? I mean, I'm running other businesses. How do we make this happen, right? So anybody who knows me knows I'm a process person. I'm obsessed with process. Everything that I'm doing, I'm trying to make my businesses run like a machine, predictably, continuing to drive results and just returning to my business without constant input from me personally. I'm going from thing to thing, executing different projects month after month. So I actually really believe that working a process and systematizing things can actually work with even creative things, even analytical things, even things when it comes to like a personal branding type of thing, like a podcast. It's about combining process with people, with software and automation to put all these pieces together and get the thing running in a predictable way. So I thought I would kind of run through one of the aspects of this podcast, which is the recruiting of interesting guests, finding interesting people. How have I built a process around this to remove myself as much as possible from the process without sacrificing quality or just making sure that my goals are intact for this thing. So it started out in the early episodes, I was the one who went out and found guests to interview on the podcast. I would mostly kind of just invite friends of mine who are running interesting businesses. I don't have that many friends, so I kind of ran out of people to interview, and inevitably the thing fell behind. We stopped booking new guests and stopped publishing episodes, and it started to fizzle out, just like most podcasts do. So that's when my editor reached out to me. He was like, maybe I can help out with this. Maybe we can build a process so that I can be the one to go out and find guests for you so that we can keep publishing episodes. And I was like, that's a great idea. So we worked together on this, and we started by listing out a few places where interesting guests can be found. So I gave him a few podcasts that I'm a fan of, that I listen to. So he looks on there to find guests who've been interviewed and might be a good fit for what I'm doing. Communities like the Founder Cafe, like Dynamite Circle, like my productized members community. He's looking to those places to find interesting people who really fit the type of conversations that I tend to have on this particular show. And my producer is the one who does all the editing, so he listens to every episode. He knows what kind of topics and people really resonate and really work well. And so what he does is he picks out a handful of potential guests every month, and he suggests them to me. But before we invite them to be interviewed, he gives me a brief about each guest. He pulls their websites. He gives me a brief kind of bio, what's really interesting about them, what could be a potential angle for an interview. He gives me some links of where they've been interviewed before by other people. And so I'm receiving all of that in an email a couple times a month, and at that point I can just kind of review and give them the thumbs up or not quite. And because I'm actually pretty picky about who we invite on the show. I really want to find people who I'm genuinely interested in learning from, and I want to hear their story, and I think will actually help my audience get ahead. So I review everyone, and for those that I just don't think are quite the right fit, I'll tell him the reason why I don't think it's the right fit right now, and that kind of adds to his knowledge base of being able to pick out better guests to interview going forward. So it's really light touch for me. I'm really just receiving an email, giving it a quick glance over, and most of the time giving him a thumbs up to send the interview. So he sends the invite. We've got like a template email. He says like, hey, I'm the producer of Brian Casel's podcast. We'd love to invite you on for an interview. And the person, they get my Calendly link. They book the call. I only do interviews every Tuesday afternoon. That's kind of like my time box to do podcast interviews. The rest of the week, I'm doing other stuff. I'm working on the other businesses. So that's just one example of how again I've made it really light touch for me, but it still achieves the end goal of getting interesting people to be interviewed on the show. So we've done that with guests. The production, from the editing to the music, the show notes, the transcriptions, the links, posting to WordPress, even into the promotion, sending out that email, sending out social media from my channels for every episode. All that stuff is being handled by my producer or one of the assistants. I'm literally just showing up every Tuesday to do interviews, and this podcast continues to, it's been doing pretty well. So besides process and people, we work in quite a few software tools to make all this stuff really work like clockwork. I talked about the brief that my producer sends me about every guest. That's actually a gravity form on a page. It's a public page on my site, on the podcasting site. It's kind of like a suggest a guest page, and so he fills that out. And it has all the questions that I would want to hear about for a potential guest to figure out, are they going to be a good fit for this? That goes through Zapier into a Trello board where we manage all the potential guests. It's kind of like a funnel where we're tracking all that stuff. It's mostly my producer doing all this stuff, but then they book on Calendly. We use my software Ops Calendar, which is a content calendar tool, and And I designed it for this sort of thing, like managing podcast episodes and blog posts. And that schedules out the social media posts for later when the podcast episode publishes. We also use it to manage the checklist and map out the due dates, based on the published date of every episode. So a couple of years ago, when I did the same sort of thing for my blog, for my business, I was like, this is a process that other businesses can use. So that became Audience Ops, which we've been doing for the last 3 years. And so now this month, with Audience Ops, we've been working on the same thing with podcasting, taking what's been working pretty well for my podcast, packaging it up, taking process, people, software tools, putting these pieces together, and putting together a new line from Audience Ops called Audience Ops Podcasting. And it's been going pretty well so far. We're just getting it off the ground right now. We've got a handful of customers, getting started up this month. It'll be interesting to see what happens with it, I think. It's going pretty well so far. We're, again, we're just starting it up. And again, it's just about tackling a problem, incorporating process, people, systems, automation, software. It's been fun. So happy to answer any questions, in the hallway, at the parties. About podcasting, productized services, SaaS, anything like that, just come find me and happy to talk. Thanks.